She survived Henry VIII, only to die screaming that her husband poisoned her. Katherine Parr, the queen who outlived the tyrant king, thought she'd finally found love. But in September 1548, days after giving birth, fever ripped through her body. As death closed in, she looked at Thomas Seymour and whispered the unthinkable: murder. Within 7 months, his head would roll on Tower Hill for treason. Was Catherine's accusation the ravings of a dying mind? Or did she see the truth no one else would believe? Smash that subscribe button, because this gets darker than the tower itself. January 28th, 1547. King Henry VIII was dead. England mourned. Bells tolled across London. But at Chelsea Manor, Katherine Parr wasn't mourning. She was falling in love. Within weeks of the king's death, a man began visiting her chambers after dark. Thomas Seymour. Tall, charming, devastatingly ambitious. He was the brother of Edward Seymour, the new Lord Protector, who now controlled England in young King Edward's name. Thomas had wanted Katherine years ago, before Henry noticed her, before she became queen. Now, with Henry barely cold in his tomb at Windsor, Thomas came calling again. Katherine ordered the gates left unlocked at night. Servants whispered as shadows moved through corridors. By May 1547, less than 4 months after Henry's death, Katherine Parr and Thomas Seymour were married in secret. No royal approval, no formal announcement. Just a quiet ceremony that would have been considered treason if Henry were still alive. When the marriage became public in June, the court exploded in scandal. 4 months. The king's widow had remarried in 4 months. It was an insult to Henry's memory, a slap in the face to royal protocol. The speed was shocking even by Tudor standards, where widows typically waited at least a year before remarrying. But Katherine had waited long enough. She'd been queen to a dying tyrant for 4 years. She'd nursed his rotting leg, endured his paranoia, survived his murderous rages. Now she wanted something for herself. The Duchess of Somerset Thomas's own sister-in-law was furious. Anne Stanhope had always despised Katherine, and now she had ammunition. She convinced her husband, the Lord Protector, to strip Katherine of the jewels she'd inherited as Queen Dowager. The finest pieces that should have been Katherine's by right were confiscated. It was petty revenge, but it worked. Katherine's status crumbled overnight. She was no longer the respected Queen Dowager. She was the scandalous widow who couldn't wait to climb into another man's bed. Thomas himself seemed unbothered by the controversy. He'd gotten what he wanted: Katherine's wealth, her connections, her status. But there was a problem. His brother Edward controlled the government. Edward was Lord Protector, the most powerful man in England. Thomas? He'd been given the hollow title of Lord High Admiral. It sounded impressive, but meant nothing. No seat on the Privy Council. No real influence over the boy king. Just a ceremonial position to keep him quiet. Thomas Seymour was not a man who stayed quiet. He began plotting almost immediately, gathering followers, stockpiling weapons, spreading poison about his brother at court. He smiled at Katherine over dinner while scheming behind her back. She'd married him thinking she'd finally chosen love over duty. She had no idea she'd just chained herself to the most dangerous man in England, a man whose ambition would destroy everything it touched, including her. Outwardly, Thomas Seymour looked like Katherine's reward for surviving Henry VIII. He was everything the old king was not younger: handsome, easy with a joke, able to fill a room with charm instead of fear. After years of walking on eggshells around a man who could sign death warrants at breakfast, Katherine had chosen someone who seemed to bring light back into her life. But behind that easy smile was a man who measured every relationship in terms of power. Before Henry married Katherine, Thomas had already tried to secure his future at court through marriage. He had shown interest in both Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, feeling out the possibility of wedding a royal Tudor woman. Those plans went nowhere. Then Henry chose Katherine for himself, and Thomas was pushed to the edge of the story watching as the woman he wanted became queen to his king. By 1547, the balance of power in England had shifted completely. Henry was dead. His 9-year-old son, Edward, sat on the throne, and real authority rested with Thomas's elder brother, Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. Edward controlled the Privy Council, the armies, and the royal household. Thomas held the title of Lord High Admiral, but titles meant little without access to real decisions. He had rank, but not enough influence. Proximity to the Queen Dowager gave him money and status. It did not give him the crown. That imbalance aided him. Thomas began crafting a new identity for himself. The generous uncle, the approachable noble, the man who could slip through strict court etiquette and win hearts. With young King Edward, he played the indulgent relative, slipping the boy coins and gifts, telling him he should one day rule in his own right and not rely so heavily on his governors. It sounded affectionate, almost harmless, but underneath was a quiet attempt to loosen the Lord Protector's grip on the boy's loyalty. With Katherine, the performance was subtler. He was loving, attentive, and playful in a way Henry had never been. He made her feel chosen for herself, not for dynastic convenience. But his financial and political moves told another story. He invested carefully, gathered contacts among dissatisfied nobles, and paid attention to anyone publicly frustrated with his brother's rule. Catherine's household, full of educated reformers and talented servants, gave him access to letters, gossip, and networks beyond his own faction. What made Thomas truly dangerous was not brute cruelty, but a willingness to gamble with people's lives as if they were pieces on a board. He did not need to shout or threaten to be destructive. He simply pushed and pushed until others were placed in impossible positions. His rivalry with his brother was no ordinary family disagreement. It was a cold war at the top of the Tudor regime, with Catherine's home caught right between them. Katherine, ever intelligent and politically aware, must have seen some of this tension. But she also saw the man who sat with her over books, who discussed religion, who treated her like a partner rather than a patient to be managed. After surviving Henry, she wanted to believe she had finally chosen freely and chosen well. She hadn't yet realized that the man she'd married was already looking beyond her. For Thomas Seymour, Katherine was not the destination. She was the bridge wealth, respectability, and a household that soon would include the most dangerous asset of all, a teenage princess named Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth did not simply appear in Catherine's story by accident. Thomas made sure she was brought into their orbit. After the secret marriage became public and the court began to whisper, Katherine used one of the few powers she still had, her influence as the king's widow, to request that the 14-year-old Elizabeth join her household. On the surface, it looked like a generous act. Katherine had been a loving stepmother to Elizabeth under Henry, encouraging her education and Protestant faith. Bringing the girl to live with her at Chelsea seemed like a way to protect and guide her in the uncertain world after the king's death. For Elizabeth, the invitation was an honor and a relief. She had grown up watching her father's wives disappear, one by one. The woman who had treated her kindly was now offering a home, tutors, and stability. Chelsea quickly became a small court of its own books, lessons, prayers, and the quiet confidence that came from being in the household of a former queen. On paper, it was the safest place a Tudor princess could be. But the moment Elizabeth crossed that threshold, the balance inside the house shifted. Now, under one roof, Thomas Seymour had three things he craved: Catherine's wealth and status, a direct connection to the young king through his role as uncle, and daily access to a teenage princess with royal blood. Katherine saw herself as guardian and mentor. Thomas saw opportunity. Where she imagined a family, herself, her new husband, and the girl she loved like a daughter, he began to see a ladder. The household routine gave him space to move. Katherine oversaw the running of the house and the intellectual life of her stepdaughter. Thomas drifted along the edges, sharing meals, passing through gardens, exchanging casual words in corridors. Nothing openly shocking, nothing that could be easily called out. But slowly, the rhythm changed. Servants noticed which doors opened early, which footsteps echoed at strange hours, which jokes made the princess blush and look away. Elizabeth, brilliant and observant even as a teenager, must have felt the ground under her feet start to tilt. Thomas was her stepfather by marriage, but far closer to her in age than Henry had been. He knew how to make her laugh, how to speak to her, not just as a subject, but as a girl on the verge of womanhood. In a house where Katherine was trying to build something like peace after years of surviving a king, lines that should have been clear began to blur. For a while, Katherine tried to fold this tension into her image of a happy household. She joined in some of the playfulness, perhaps telling herself that nothing truly dangerous was happening, that she was in control. But the more Thomas tested the limits, the more that illusion began to crack. What had started as a sanctuary was slowly turning into a stage, and every person in that house queen dowager, princess, and servants was being drawn into a story they did not fully understand. By the time Katherine realized that Thomas's attention to Elizabeth was not just careless affection but a threat, the damage inside her carefully built household had already begun. The next step would force her to make a choice no woman should ever have to make, between the man she had finally chosen for herself and the girl she had once promised to protect. By the time spring turned to summer in 1548, Katherine's world was already hairline cracked. She just didn't know which blow would finally shatter it. The first sign of hope came quietly. Missed days. Subtle changes her ladies noticed before she spoke the words aloud. For the first time in her life, after 4 marriages and years of danger, Katherine Parr was pregnant. In an age when women were expected to produce heirs, and yet often died trying, this was both miracle and warning. Still, she chose to see the light. Letters flew to old friends and stepdaughters, carrying cautious joy. The queen who had only ever been stepmother might, at last, become a mother herself. For a while, the pregnancy softened the edges of the house. Talk shifted from court politics to baby linen, names, and prayers for a safe delivery. Katherine's friends knew the risks. She was in her mid-30s, and childbirth had already claimed queens before her, but they also knew her strength. She had survived plague, political plots, and Henry VIII. Surely she could survive this. But pregnancy did not pause Thomas Seymour's restlessness. As Katherine's body slowed, Thomas's impatience accelerated. He still burned over his brother's control of the government. He still nursed the humiliation of being kept away from real power. The house at Chelsea, then Sudeley, began to feel less like a home and more like a waiting room. He visited London, cultivated allies, and listened hungrily to any complaint about the Lord Protector. Katherine's condition created a strange split in their marriage. She was turning inward, preparing for a child. He was looking outward, preparing for an opportunity. Inside the household, the tension around Elizabeth could no longer be written off as harmless. What had once been brushed aside as playful now looked unbearable in the cold light of Katherine's advanced pregnancy. The princess was growing older, more aware, more uncomfortable. Servants who had once laughed nervously at Thomas's familiarity now looked away or fell silent. Small details, a glance, a stiff greeting, a door closed a little too quickly told Katherine that the atmosphere in her home had changed. The breaking point came in a moment no one could take back. One day, Katherine walked into a room and found what she had been trying not to see. Thomas and Elizabeth together. Too close. Too intimate for a stepfather and stepdaughter. No jokes, no pretense, just a scene that made everything she had ignored snap into focus. For a woman who had navigated Henry's court with such careful intelligence, the shock must have felt like a physical blow. The confrontation that followed didn't need raised voices to be devastating. Katherine understood, in an instant, that the man she had fought to marry and the girl she had tried to protect could no longer exist under the same roof. The household she, Dee hoped would be a refuge, had become a place of danger for Elizabeth and a place of humiliation for herself. So she made the only choice left to her. Elizabeth was sent away from the house, removed from the man who should have been a guardian, not a threat. The separation was swift and final. Whatever warmth had once existed between Katherine and Thomas cooled into something brittle and hard. She remained with him, heavily pregnant, in a home now haunted by absence, the empty place at table where Elizabeth had sat, the quiet rooms where lessons had once echoed. As Katherine's pregnancy advanced, she carried more than a child. She carried the knowledge that the love she had chosen after Henry was not the safe harbor she had believed. The future segments of her story will follow that pregnancy to its end through a difficult birth, a rising fever, and the moment when every buried doubt about Thomas Seymour would erupt in her final, terrifying accusation. A late summer heat hung over Sudeley Castle when the first pains began. After the explosions of jealousy, scandal, and exile that had torn her household apart, Katherine's world had narrowed to one small set of rooms and one single goal: survive the birth. She had sent Elizabeth away, learned to live with the silence that followed, and tried to push thoughts of Thomas's restless ambition to the edge of her mind. Now, every breath, every prayer was for the child she carried. For once, the future she imagined was simple cradle, lullabies, and a life that was finally hers to shape. On the 30th of August, 1548, the labor started in earnest. Servants hurried along stone corridors. Midwives were called, and the castle closed in around the Queen Dowager. Outside, the Gloucestershire countryside kept its calm. Inside, hours stretched and blurred. Katherine knew the risks better than most. She had watched Jane Seymour die after bringing Edward into the world. She had seen how quickly joy could turn to mourning when childbirth went wrong. Yet as the contraction seized her, she clung to the hope that her long record of survival would hold one more time. The birth was hard, but it did not end in immediate catastrophe. When the child finally arrived, a small, squalling girl relief washed through the chamber. They named her Mary Seymour, a choice that carried layers of meaning. Naming the baby after Mary Tudor, her stepdaughter, may have been an attempt to mend at least one of the fractures caused by her swift remarriage. For Katherine herself, it was more personal. The name tied her newborn daughter to the wider Tudor family she had spent years trying to hold together. For a brief moment, it looked as if she had succeeded. Those first days after the birth were deceptively gentle. Katherine was reported to be in good spirits. She spoke of the child, asked after her household, and let herself imagine a future where she could simply be mother instead of wife of Henry VIII, or Queen Dowager. In those quiet intervals between pains and exhaustion, she might have believed that the worst storms of her life were finally behind her. Thomas moved in and out of the picture, a restless presence in the background. There were smiles, polite words, gestures that could pass for affection, but the rift between them opened by his behavior with Elizabeth had not healed. He had gained a daughter and secured his late wife's wealth, but his eyes were already turning back toward London and the power he felt his brother had stolen. Katherine, weakened by labor, could no longer follow him into that dangerous world. Their paths were starting to diverge, even as their child linked them forever. Still, in those first 6 days, the story could have ended differently. No fever yet, no delirium. Just a woman recovering from a brutal ordeal, and a tiny infant whose life had only just begun. The castle breathed out in cautious relief. Servants relaxed. The midwives must have thought they had escaped the nightmare they all knew too well. They were wrong. The danger of Tudor childbirth did not end when the baby's first cry echoed through the room. It often began right after. And as the next section will show, something unseen had already taken hold inside Katherine's body quiet, invisible and far more lethal than any open enemy she had ever faced. After 6 days of cautious relief, The change was so small at first that it was easy to ignore. A little more heat in her skin, a deeper ache low in her body. For any woman who had just labored through childbirth, it could have passed as ordinary recovery. But Katherine knew her own strength, and this felt different. The tiredness was heavier. The pain didn't ebb. It crept. The women around her had seen it before, even if they had no words for bacteria or infection. Childbed fever was the shadow that hung over every cradle in Tudor England, striking without warning days after what seemed like a successful birth. One moment, a mother was propped against her pillows, talking of christenings and futures. The next, she was burning from the inside out. When Katherine's temperature climbed and her belly grew tender to the touch, the midwives and attendants would have recognized the pattern with a sick drop in their stomachs. This was not simple exhaustion. Something inside her had turned. As the fever took hold, the walls of Katherine's world closed in. The bright, promising days after Mary's birth blurred into a cycle of sweating, shivering and drifting in and out of uneasy sleep. The room that had felt like a sanctuary now trapped her with her own thoughts. Pain has a way of stripping people back to their rawest fears, and Katherine had more than most. She had watched Henry's third wife die after childbirth. She had outlived a king who had nearly sent her to the block for her religious beliefs. Now, lying in a darkened chamber at Sudeley, she would have understood exactly what it meant when her body started to fail. Outside that room, life went on. Servants still carried food, tended fires, walked the halls. Somewhere in the castle, her newborn daughter slept and wailed and fed, oblivious to the fact that her mother was slipping further from her each day. Thomas moved between the sick room and his own affairs, a figure half in shadow. To some, he might have looked like a worried husband. To others, like a man already thinking beyond the bed, where his wife lay fighting an invisible enemy. The fever did more than ravage Katherine's body. It warped her sense of reality. In clear moments, she could speak calmly, ask after Mary, recall prayers and familiar verses. But as the infection deepened, those Clare Islands grew smaller and further apart. Delirium came in waves, snatches of memory, flashes of suspicion, old fears stirred up and magnified. People she had once trusted blurred into the faces of men who'd signed warrants, or courtiers who had smiled as queens disappeared. Pain and broken sleep made it hard to separate what was happening now from everything she had survived before. This was the cruelest twist of childbed fever. It attacked not just the flesh, but the mind. Thoughts that might once have been fleeting anxieties could harden into absolute conviction under the pressure of heat and terror. Every cool cloth pressed to her skin, every hushed conversation at the edge of her hearing, could feed the feeling that something was wrong beyond the illness itself. The line between physical agony and emotional betrayal began to dissolve. By now, the people closest to her would have known the odds. In houses across England, women who developed this same fever after childbirth rarely lived long once the signs appeared. Remedies were powerless. Prayers were all that remained. Katherine, who had spent years reading, debating, and writing about faith, now faced the test at its most brutal point. Alone with her pain, her memories, and the man who stood most to gain from her death, she began to give voice to the darkest conclusion forming in her fevered mind. In the next stage of her story, those thoughts will harden into words. On that sickbed at Sudeley, the queen who had once out-argued bishops and outlived a king will turn her gaze on her husband and utter an accusation that would echo far beyond the walls of her room. When the fever was at its worst, the daylight in Katherine's chamber seemed to thin into something gray and slippery. Faces hovered at the edge of her vision, ladies, physicians, servants, but the one she kept returning to was Thomas. Sometimes he was at her bedside, sometimes only in her thoughts, but in her broken sleep, the two blurred into one. Pain has a way of sharpening old wounds, and in those hours, the memories she'd tried to bury came back with brutal clarity. Elizabeth's sudden removal, the embarrassed glances of servants, The way Thomas had drifted further from her with every step he took toward his own ambitions. There was one witness in that room who later tried to make sense of what happened. Elizabeth Tyrwhitt, Catherine's lady and friend. She would remember that as the fever raged, Catherine's mind moved between prayer and accusation. In one moment, the Queen Dowager spoke like the devout reformer she had always been, calling on God and reciting familiar lines of comfort. In the next, her voice shifted, no longer pleading with heaven, but turning on the man at her side. She spoke of betrayal, of being wronged by those I loved best. Words that cut far deeper than any physician's knife ever could. To the people in that room, the transformation must have been terrifying. Katherine had long been known for her composure. This was the woman who had debated theology with Henry VIII, and when he briefly wanted her arrested, had talked her way back into his favor with calm intelligence. Now that same mind was splintering under heat and agony, her thoughts circling the one conclusion she could no longer avoid. The man she had chosen after Henry, the one she believed would finally bring her peace, now stood in her imagination as the architect of her suffering. In clearer intervals, they tried to soothe her. Thomas, when present, offered the right words: concern, reassurance, the promise that she was loved. The women wiped her brow, adjusted her linens, murmured that the fever made her say things she did not truly mean. But fevers do not invent new fears. They often magnify the ones already buried. Every slight she had excused, every uneasy look between her husband and Elizabeth, every rumor of his schemes at court, all of it now fed the idea that her illness was not just misfortune, but design. It was during one of these jagged exchanges that Catherine's accusation formed fully. Struggling against the fog in her mind, she fixed her gaze on Thomas and spoke not as a delirious patient, but as a woman who believed she had been fatally deceived. She said he had wronged her, that he had brought her to this state, that she was not dying by chance. The word poison hung in the air, not always spoken plainly, but present in the way she described what had been done to her. To Elizabeth Tyrwhitt, who later tried to record the scene, it was clear that her mistress saw herself as a woman destroyed from within and betrayed from without. Whether Thomas flinched at those words, no one can say with certainty. He denied wrongdoing, of course. Any husband in his position would. Yet the accusation could not be taken back. It settled over the room like a stain. Even if the women present believed the fever had warped her judgment, they could not ignore what it revealed about the state of her heart. Katherine Parr, who had navigated some of the most dangerous politics in Europe, now faced her final hours convinced that the greatest danger had been lying beside her. In the next section of this story, the focus will shift from what Katherine said to what happened after the words were spoken. The final hours before dawn, the stillness that followed her last breath, and the way Thomas stepped out of that sick room into a future that would prove her darkest suspicions closer to the truth than anyone in that castle wanted to admit. The hours between Catherine's accusation and her death moved with a strange, slow inevitability. After the confrontation, the room fell into a quieter rhythm, not peaceful, but exhausted. There was nothing left to say. The women stayed close, adjusting pillows, offering water, murmuring prayers that became background noise to Catherine's labored breathing. Thomas withdrew to the edges, whether from shame, calculation, or simply because there was no comfort he could offer that would undo what had been said between them. As night deepened on September 4th, Catherine's strength finally began to ebb in earnest. The fever had burned through her for days, and now her body had no reserves left. The pain that had torn through her belly eased slightly, not because she was healing, but because she was slipping beyond the point where her nerves could register it. Her pulse grew faint. Her breathing turned shallow and irregular. The women who had attended her through the worst now watched for the inevitable end, knowing there was nothing more they could do but witness. Somewhere in the castle, her daughter slept. Mary Seymour was less than a week old, too young to know that the woman who had carried her would never hold her again. In the practical, brutal logic of Tudor England, arrangements were already being considered. Who would care for the child? Who would control the inheritance? What would happen to the household once its center was gone? But in that sick room, as the candles flickered low, such questions still felt distant. For now, the only thing that mattered was the woman in the bed and the space between her breaths growing longer. Katherine Parr died in the early hours of September 5, 1548. Accounts place the time between 2 and 3 in the morning, the hour when the body's defenses are lowest, when even the strongest slip away. She had outlived Henry VIII by just over 18 months. She had survived court intrigue, religious persecution, and the constant danger of being a queen in a king's world. In the end, none of that mattered. Childbirth, the oldest killer of women, claimed her as it had claimed so many others. Thomas Seymour did not linger at Sudeley. Within hours of her death, he was already preparing to leave, organizing his affairs, shifting his focus from the woman who had just died to the opportunities her death created. There were no grand displays of mourning, no dramatic collapses at her bedside. He moved quickly, efficiently, like a man who had already begun thinking past this moment before it arrived. To some in the household, his behavior must have seemed callous. To others, simply practical. Either way, it cast a shadow over everything Katherine had said in her delirium. Her body was prepared according to custom. They wrapped her in wax-soaked cerecloth to slow decay, then sealed her in a lead-lined coffin to contain the remains until burial. For 2 days, she lay in her privy chamber at Sudeley, while arrangements were made. The household moved around her with the strange double awareness that comes after sudden death. The person is gone, but the physical presence remains, demanding ritual and respect even as life continues. On September 7th, they carried Katherine Parr to the chapel at Sudeley Castle and laid her to rest. The burial was conducted with full honors. Lady Jane Grey, the 11-year-old girl who had been living in Katherine's household as a ward, served as chief mourner, a role that must have been bewildering for a child. Within 5 years, Jane herself would be executed as the 9 days queen, another young woman destroyed by the ambitions of men around her. Katherine's grave was marked, her coffin placed with care, and the household began to disperse. But her story did not end with that burial. The accusations she made in her final hours, the speed with which Thomas moved on, and the violent end that awaited him in the months ahead would all cast her death in a darker light. The next segment will follow Thomas Seymour as he steps out of Katherine's shadow and into the full glare of treason, proving, in the end, that the woman who accused him from her deathbed may have seen him more clearly than anyone else ever did. Katherine's coffin had barely settled into the chapel floor at Sudeley before Thomas Seymour began treating her death, less like an ending and more like a chance to restart his own story. The Queen Dowager was gone. The fever, the accusations, the long nights in her chamber, all of it closed behind him as he turned his back on the castle and rode toward London. He left behind a newborn daughter, a grieving household, and a grave that would one day be praised for its beauty. What occupied his mind now was not mourning, but power. On paper, Thomas was in a stronger position than ever. He was uncle to King Edward VI, former Lord High Admiral, and widower of Henry VIII's last queen. Through Katherine, he had enjoyed access to wealth, property, and a household that had acted as a quiet hub for reformist nobles and intellectuals. Her death did not erase those connections. If anything, it simplified them. The estates and goods tied to their marriage now flowed increasingly under his control. The only real complication was the existence of their infant daughter, Mary, a complication Thomas did not linger on for long. Back at court, the same old problem awaited him. His brother, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, still ruled as Lord Protector, the man effectively running England in the name of the boy king. Thomas had always hated that imbalance. He believed he deserved a share of that authority, if not outright dominance. Katherine's presence had once anchored him, softened some of his roughest edges, and offered a kind of domestic legitimacy. Without her, there was nothing holding him back from the risks he had only flirted with before. He began to move with a new boldness. Money, which Katherine had tried to manage carefully, now sluiced into schemes and quiet recruitment. Thomas spoke to soldiers, minor gentlemen, anyone discontented with Somerset's rule. He polished the image he'd already been crafting. Not just a charming uncle, but a man who understood the king's needs better than a dry, distant protector. To disaffected ears, his promises sounded daring rather than reckless. To the government watching from the council chamber, they looked like warning signs. At the center of his calculations stood the same two figures who had shaped so much of Catherine's final year, young King Edward and Princess Elizabeth. The idea was as dangerous as it was simple. Win the affection of the king. Secure a marriage with Elizabeth. Do both, and he would stand at the crossroads of power guardian to the reigning boy and husband to the girl, who might one day wear the crown if Edward died. With Katherine gone, there was no longer a respected queen dowager in the way, no moderating presence reminding him where the line lay. Catherine's deathbed accusations now hung behind all of this like a ghost no one at court could quite see, but the audience of your video will. In her fever, she said that those she loved best had destroyed her. In the cold light of London politics, Thomas was now about to prove just how far a man like that was willing to go when no one remained to question him in private. The next steps, his late-night visit to the king's chambers, the dead spaniel, the arrest, will not feel like sudden madness, but the inevitable climax of a pattern that had been building since the moment he first slipped through the gates to court Katherine Parr in the dark. When Thomas finally overstepped, it didn't look like the beginning of a rebellion. It looked like a late-night visit gone wrong. In the months after Catherine's death, he had been slowly tightening the threads of his plan, visiting the king, complaining about his brother, hinting that Edward was old enough to rule without constant supervision. To the boy, still only about 11, Thomas seemed like the one adult who treated him less like a fragile symbol and more like a person. Gifts, coins, easy conversation, each small kindness was really a test. How far could he push before someone pulled him back? The answer came on a winter night in January 1549. Under cover of darkness, Thomas made his way toward Hampton Court, where the young king was lodged. He was armed, not as a courtier visiting family, but as a man ready to force a turning point. Whether he meant to kidnap Edward, wake him and pressure him into siding against the Lord Protector, or simply test how easily he could reach the royal bed, no one can say with certainty. What is clear is that he bypassed the normal channels, ignored protocol, and tried to enter the king's private chambers alone. Inside those rooms, there was one small guardian Thomas had not accounted for, the king's spaniel. As he approached, the dog began to bark sharp, insistent, the kind of sound that slices through sleep and silence alike. In that moment, Thomas made the worst possible choice. Instead of retreating, he silenced the animal with a shot. The crack of the pistol did what the dog alone could not. It woke the household. Guards and attendants came running. The spell of secrecy shattered in an instant. No one could mistake what they found. The king's uncle, armed, near the boy's chamber, with a dead dog at his feet. All those quiet rumors about Thomas's ambitions, all the whispered complaints about Somerset's brother, suddenly had a scene they could cling to. This was no longer just dissatisfaction or loose talk. This looked like attempted access to the king by force. He was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the same fortress where queens had awaited execution and enemies of the crown had vanished behind walls of stone. For a man who had once moved so easily through palaces and gardens, the echoing corridors and locked doors must have felt like a brutal reminder that his charm had limits. Titles, family ties, even his past service could not shield him now. The government had been given exactly what it needed, a concrete act that could be framed as treason. From this point on, Thomas's story shifts from whispered influence to written charges and interrogations. Counselors combed through his past behavior, his marriage to Katherine, his contact with Elizabeth, his recruitment of support, and began to shape it into a case. The next section will step inside that process. The long days in the Tower, the questioning of Elizabeth's household, and the moment when Parliament chose to condemn him without even granting the full public trial he might have believed his rank would guarantee. Once Thomas was inside the Tower, the story stopped being just about him. The net widened, and the next name it caught was Elizabeth. The council knew Thomas hadn't acted in a vacuum. A king's uncle doesn't he suddenly appear outside the royal bedchamber with a loaded weapon unless there's a long pattern behind it. They began piecing that pattern together. His complaints about Somerset, his efforts to win Edward's affection, his sudden access to wealth after Catherine's death. But there was one part of his past they were especially interested in: the months he had shared a roof with the teenage princess at Chelsea. Messengers rode out to Hatfield, where Elizabeth now lived in a quieter, more controlled household. She was about 15, highly educated, and already known for her sharp mind. She also carried a dangerous history: the memory of those games at Chelsea, the early morning visits, the moment Katherine had walked in and sent her away. What had once been an uncomfortable secret inside one house was now of interest to the entire regime. The authorities didn't drag Elizabeth to the Tower, but they surrounded her with questions. Her closest servants, however, were not spared. Cot Ashley, her governess and confidant, and Thomas Parry, her cofferer, were taken and interrogated. Under pressure, they described what they had witnessed. Thomas slipping into Elizabeth's chamber at dawn, tickling her in bed, cutting her gown in the garden while Katherine watched uneasily. They spoke of the princess blushing when his name was mentioned, of a fondness that looked, to outsiders, like the beginning of something far more dangerous. Every detail they provided did two things at once. It blackened Thomas's reputation and put Elizabeth's future on a knife edge. In a court where a woman's honor could define her entire political value, the suggestion that the king's teenage sister had been entangled willingly or not with a married man and now accused traitor was explosive. If the council decided to paint her as complicit, she could easily have followed Thomas down the path of disgrace, imprisonment, or worse. Elizabeth understood that immediately. When royal envoys came to question her, she did not cry, rage, or confess. She did what she would become famous for later as queen. She chose every word with surgical care. She admitted nothing that could tie her to Thomas's schemes. She did not deny that he had behaved in ways others might find improper, but she presented herself as a girl who had been acted upon, not a partner in anything. She kept emotion under tight control, letting her youth and apparent obedience shield her where raw honesty might have destroyed her. Meanwhile, in London, counselors turned the evidence against Thomas into something more formal. Instead of giving him the public, high-profile trial he might have expected as a peer and royal uncle, they chose a different weapon, an act of attainder. On parchment and in council chambers, his actions were reshaped into a list of charges: plotting to seize the king, planning to marry Elizabeth without consent, stockpiling men and arms, betraying the trust placed in him by blood and office. The decision to proceed this way says everything about how dangerous they believed him to be. A trial could be unpredictable. Public sympathy and court factions might intervene. An act passed through Parliament, however, would condemn him without the risk of him turning the stage into a platform. The same charm he had used on Katherine, on Edward, and on so many others would not be given another audience. In the next section, that act will pass, the sentence will be set, and Thomas Seymour, the man who thought he could bend a kingdom to his will discover that the state he tried to manipulate has only one answer for a traitor, even if he once shared a queen's bed and a king's blood. The act that sealed Thomas Seymour's fate didn't happen on a scaffold. It happened on paper, while he sat in the Tower, probably still half convinced his blood and rank would protect him. Men in robes and velvet gathered in chambers to decide his future without him. The council had already laid out the pattern. The night at Hampton Court, the dead spaniel, the weapons and money he'd collected, the reckless talk about ruling through the young king, the plan to marry Elizabeth without consent. Now those threads were woven into a single deadly label treason. Instead of granting him a full public trial, they chose an act of attainder, a legal shortcut that turned Parliament into judge and jury. Line by line, the charges painted Thomas as something worse than just an over-ambitious uncle. He was described as a man who had betrayed the king's trust, endangered the realm, and used his closeness to the royal family as a weapon. Each accusation chipped away at the image he had so carefully built. Not the charming courtier, not the indulgent uncle, but a corrupter of a boy king and a threat to the crown's stability. As the bill moved through Lords and Commons, some must have hesitated. This was, after all, the king's own uncle and the brother of the Lord Protector. Executing him meant admitting that rot had spread right into the royal family. But others would have remembered the chaos of the previous reign, the beheadings, the conspiracies, the way unchecked ambition had already torn the court apart once before. Letting Thomas live, with his charisma and his history with Elizabeth, looked like a gamble England could not afford. In the Tower, Thomas received the news not with a dramatic courtroom sentence, but as a decision already made. No chance to grandstand, no last-minute plea to a jury of peers. Just the cold fact that Parliament had agreed he should die. Everything he'd inherited or gained through Katherine lands, income, influence, was declared forfeit. His daughter Mary, not yet strong enough to sit up on her own, was stripped of the security her mother had hoped to give her. Catherine's warnings on her deathbed, spoken through fever and pain, suddenly seemed less like the ramblings of a delirious woman and more like a clear reading of the man she had married. The morning of his execution in March 1549, Thomas walked out onto Tower Hill, not as the daring figure he liked to imagine, but as the final link in a chain of his own making. The crowd would have seen a familiar pattern. Another noble brought low, another body about to meet the axe for reaching too far. Unlike Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard, Thomas had not been destroyed by a king's jealousy, but by his own refusal to accept limits. With a single stroke, the story that had begun in secret visits to Catherine's chamber and flirtations with Elizabeth ended in the same public theater that had claimed so many before him. His fall cleared the board for others, but it did not erase the damage left behind. A dead queen, a traumatized princess, and an infant who had slipped quietly out of the records. In your next segment, the focus can shift from his last breath on Tower Hill to the people who had to live with what he done, especially Elizabeth and Mary, and to the question that still haunts Catherine as grave at Sudeley, whether her final, desperate judgment of Thomas Seymour was closer to the truth than the careful verdicts written by men in Parliament ever admitted. When the axe fell on Tower Hill, it didn't just end Thomas Seymour's life. It snapped the last visible thread, connecting back to Catherine's deathbed, and left behind a question that still hangs over Sudeley Castle like a low cloud. Was she simply unlucky? Or was she right about him all along? In the months after his execution, people who had known them both had to look back and re-evaluate everything. The man Catherine had accused in her fevered final hours turned out, undeniably, to be exactly what she had feared. Reckless, disloyal, willing to gamble with the lives of a king and a princess if it brought him closer to power. That doesn't prove he poisoned her. It does cast a cold, unforgiving light over their entire marriage. When you stand at her tomb now, it is hard not to imagine her voice cutting across the centuries. Those I loved best have brought me to this. Yet the official story stayed cautious. The records call her death what it almost certainly was medically childbed fever after the birth of Mary. No charges were ever brought over her final accusations. No inquiry opened into whether Thomas had hastened her end. It was easier, safer, to fold her into the long list of Tudor women killed by childbirth, than to suggest that a queen dowager might have been murdered in her bed. The regime already had enough scandal with Thomas's treason. It didn't need a poisoning drama layered on top. What makes this part of the story so haunting is that both truths can sit side by side. On one level, Katherine died from infection, the same invisible killer that took Jane Seymour after Edward's birth. On another, she died emotionally long before her body failed, betrayed by a husband whose eyes were always on the next prize, whose behavior with Elizabeth shattered the trust that had made her risk everything to marry him. When her mind broke under fever, it didn't invent a villain. It latched on to the man whose choices had already ruined the safe future she thought she finally earned. For your video, this section can sit like a spotlight between the past and what comes next. Up to now, viewers have watched Katherine's story unfold toward that dark bedroom scene. After this, you'll shift fully to those left walking in the wreckage. Mary, the baby who will fade from the records, and Elizabeth the princess, who will turn this trauma into a lifelong refusal to let any man hold that kind of power over her again. This is the hinge, the moment where Katherine's private suspicion and the public verdict on Thomas collide, and the audience has to ask itself which judgment they believe. When Thomas's story ended on Tower Hill, one life had already slipped out of the spotlight so quietly that most people at court probably never thought of her again. Mary Seymour was less than a year old when her father died, a baby who had never known her mother and would never remember her father, yet carried both of their legacies in her blood. She was the daughter of a queen and a condemned traitor, born into privilege and stripped of it almost instantly. Legally, Thomas's attainder crushed more than just his name. Everything he owned, lands, income, goods taken through his marriage to Katherine, was forfeited to the crown. That meant Mary lost not only a father, but the financial security her mother's position should have guaranteed. On paper, she went from potential heiress of a former queen to a child with no clear place in the system that had just branded her father an enemy of the state. In Tudor England, where lineage could be either a shield or a curse, hers suddenly looked far more like the latter. Someone still had to feed and raise her. That role fell to Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, one of Catherine Parr's closest friends, and a fiercely Protestant noblewoman with a reputation for plain speaking and stubborn loyalty. Taking Mary in was an act of both kindness and quiet defiance, a promise to the dead queen that her child wouldn't be abandoned. For a time, Mary lived under the Duchess's protection, folded into a household that was itself navigating the dangerous currents of religious and political change under Edward VI. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared in the records, Mary vanished from them. After a flurry of documents in her first couple of years, references to her guardianship, her provision, there is nothing. No record of a marriage, no later mention in wills, no clear burial entry that can be confidently tied to her. For a girl of her rank, that silence is almost as loud as an execution bell. Daughters of queens did not usually disappear without a trace. They married, inherited, made alliances. Their names showed up in dowry agreements, correspondence, property disputes. Mary's simply doesn't. Historians have tried to follow the faint trails she left. Some have speculated that she might have died in early childhood, another casualty of the appalling mortality rates that claimed so many Tudor children before their 5th birthdays. Others have tried to imagine a life lived in obscurity, perhaps under a different name, hidden away to avoid the stigma of her father's crimes. But without solid evidence, every theory remains just that, a story layered over a blank space where a person should be. For your viewers, Mary's fate is one of the bleakest parts of this narrative, precisely because it is unresolved. Katherine's tragedy is visible: a grave at Sudili, an effigy, contemporary accounts of her final days. Thomas's fall is documented in acts, letters, and the memory of a public execution. Mary, the child born from that tangled marriage, leaves almost nothing behind. She is the ghost in the story, the life that might have bridged her parents' legacies, but instead was swallowed by the same system that destroyed them. This section can end by drawing a straight emotional line. Katherine died fearing the man she loved. Thomas died chasing power he could never safely hold, and their daughter slipped quietly into the dark spaces between records. In the next part, when you shift to Elizabeth, you will be moving from a lost child to a survivor, someone who took the same trauma and Hans turned it into a ruthless determination never to let herself or her crown depend on a man like Thomas Seymour again. By the time Thomas Seymour's head fell on Tower Hill, Elizabeth had already learned the lesson that would shape her entire adult life. In Tudor England, the people closest to you could be the most dangerous. She watched his fall from a distance, but she had lived through the first act of that story at point-blank range behind the doors of Katherine Parr's house, where playful dawn visits and torn gowns had blurred the line between guardian and predator. What happened next was not just survival, it was strategy. She began quietly to rebuild herself. After the investigations, Elizabeth returned to a more controlled existence at Hatfield and other country houses, under watchful eyes and careful supervision. On the surface, she slipped back into the role expected of her: dutiful princess, diligent student, pious young woman. But the girl who sat over her books now was not the same one who had once blushed when Thomas's name was mentioned. She had seen how quickly a man's charm could turn into a threat, how easily her reputation could be dragged into another person's downfall. During questioning, she had been forced to walk a tightrope enough to seem honest, but never so much that she tied herself to his ruin. She succeeded. That narrow escape hardened something inside her. In the years that followed, people would notice certain patterns. Elizabeth surrounded herself with men advisors, favorites, suitors, but never let any of them fully dictate her course. She flirted, promised, delayed, and retreated, turning courtship into a political performance rather than a path to the altar. When counselors pressed her to marry for the sake of alliances or heirs, she always found reasons to wait. On the surface, those reasons were practical: England's stability, foreign threats, religious divisions. Underneath, there was something more personal, a memory of what it had meant to be a teenage girl cornered in her own bedroom by a man with power over her life. The echoes of the Seymour scandal can be heard in the kind of queen she later became. Elizabeth cultivated an image of almost untouchable chastity, the virgin queen whose body belonged not to a husband but to the realm itself. That image wasn't just propaganda, it was armor. By refusing to marry, she denied any man the legal right to command her to claim her, crown through her, or to trap her in the kind of unequal partnership Katherine had endured with Henry, and then in a different way with Thomas. Where her stepmother had tried to secure a little happiness by choosing love after duty, Elizabeth chose the opposite. She sacrificed personal intimacy to keep control. For your story, this section works as the emotional bridge between the devastation left by Thomas and Katherine, and the cold, glittering figure Elizabeth would later cut on the throne. The frightened teenager questioned about her involvement with a condemned traitor becomes the woman who never lets herself be cornered again. The next and final section can pull all of these threads together: Katherine's death, Thomas's execution, Mary's disappearance, and Elizabeth's transformation into one dark conclusion. In this world, survival wasn't about being lucky. It was about learning fast exactly how much love could cost and deciding never to pay that price. Katherine Parr's story is often told as the one where the queen finally gets her happy ending. She survived Henry VIII, remarried for love, and lived to tell the tale. But that version only works if you stop reading halfway through. If you follow the thread all the way to Sudeley Castle, in September 1548, you find something much darker. A woman who escaped one kind of death, only to meet another alone in a fever-drenched bed, convinced the man she had chosen was the one who destroyed her. The real horror isn't in wondering whether Thomas literally poisoned her. It's in knowing that, by the time she died, it no longer mattered. He had already poisoned everything else, her trust, her household, her last chance at a future built on something other than fear. She had spent years managing Henry's moods, walking the line between queenly duty and personal survival, always knowing that one wrong move could send her to the tower. When Henry died, she thought she was finally free to choose. She chose Thomas, and in doing so, she chose a different kind of trap, not a king's paranoia, but an ambitious man's indifference to anyone standing between him and power. What Catherine's final accusation reveals is not medical fact, but emotional truth. Whether her body was failing from infection or something more sinister, her heart had already diagnosed the problem. The man lying beside her, or standing at the edge of her sick room, was not grieving. He was calculating. She had given him wealth, status, access to royalty, and in return, he had humiliated her with her own stepdaughter, left her isolated during pregnancy, and now stood ready to inherit everything the moment she stopped breathing. Fevered or not, she saw clearly enough to name him. Within months, history proved her right in the only way Tudor England understood. Thomas Seymour, head on Tower Hill, severed for the same reckless ambition that had hollowed out their marriage. His execution didn't vindicate Katherine in the courts or the chronicles, but it confirmed what she had known in her final days, that the man she loved was capable of destroying anyone, even the woman who had made him. The grave at Sudeley still stands. Katherine rests there beneath an effigy, the only wife of Henry VIII, with a tomb that honors her as a queen. Tourists visit. Historians write careful, measured accounts of puerperal fever and Tudor obstetrics. But underneath all that marble and scholarship is a simpler, uglier story. A woman who thought survival meant escaping a tyrant king, only to learn that danger wore many faces. She had outlived Henry, but she couldn't outlive the damage done by the men who followed. Her daughter vanished from the record. Elizabeth survived by becoming untouchable, and Katherine herself lies in stone, a monument to a lesson the Tudor world taught over and over. For women in that era, love and power were never separate. They were two edges of the same blade, and marriage was the moment you pressed your throat against both and hoped you wouldn't bleed. Katherine Parr hoped. She bled anyway, and in her last hours, burning with fever and rage, she made sure someone heard her say exactly who had done it.